Welcome to the Johnson County
Says it's
Writers
recording.
Group. I am your facilitator, Cindy Brookshire. This is National Novel Writing Month, and so we're going to make tonight's gathering on Zoom a craft meeting with our special guest, mystery author Jean Heller. Jean is an 8-time Pulitzer Prize nominee, and she'll be talking about the writing process. Jean has helped many writers as a book doctor over the last 18 years. She's willing to answer any questions you have about writing novels, characterizations, sense of place, dialogue, plot, or anything in this exclusive online session. Jean is a former investigative journalist. She has reported for the St. Petersburg Times, Newsday, and the Associated Press. She is best known for breaking the news of the Tuskegee syphilis study in 1972, and she also has reported that the U.S. claims of an Iraq buildup on the Saudi Arabian border during the Gulf War in 1990 were not accurate. She's the author of 6 books. 4 of those books are the Deuce Mora mystery series. The titles of those books are The Someday File, The Hunting Ground, Burning Rage, and Ill Wind, which was released earlier this year. She's also the author of 2 thrillers, Maximum Impact and Handyman. Her publishers are Books Be Nimble and St. Martin's Press. Her official author site is jeanhellerbooks.com. She's a resident of Clayton, North Carolina. Welcome, Jean. You have the floor.
Thank you. It's nice of you all to come, and I'll see you again the next time. I didn't realize I had done all that. That was kind of a long introduction. I'll try to be a little more interesting tonight. We're going to talk tonight about novel structure and how you and that includes all of the things that Cindy she listed. I'll get the word right in a minute. And anything else that you'd like to throw in to the discussion. I don't want to take up a whole lot of time lecturing. I don't know what that was all about. I don't want to take up a whole lot of time lecturing you on how to do things, because how I would do them isn't necessarily how you want to do them or even how you should do them. There is a way to set up a book, and I'm primarily a novel and a thriller writer. So, but this outline works for any genre that you care to undertake, whether it's science fiction or cozies, whatever. First, you have to clearly map out your plot progression. And that is basically just an outline of where the story starts, where it goes, where it ends. Within that plot progression, you need to build the sense of place, where the story is taking place and what it looks like, what it smells like, what it feels like, so that people feel like they're there with you. And I'll give you a tip later that I learned from Stephen King on a really good way to do that. And then as you go through the story, you'll have some central themes that you want to explore, like abusive behavior, for example. You'll want to strike a certain number of chords on that subject and amplify them so that people know what the story's about. There are there are all kinds of ways to build a story structure. I was just reading an article earlier today about plot, and it suggested that you start with a protagonist who is living some kind of normal life, and that goes on for a while, and then something interrupts that normal life and throws the protagonist into a world of events that he or she never contemplated and may not even believe that he or she can cope with. I don't think that's the right way to start. I think we all live normal lives, and they're not particularly interesting to other people. They may be fascinating to us, but not to other people. I think I have always preached that the most important paragraph of any story is the first one. The most important chapter is the first one, because people don't read that much lengthy material anymore. And if you don't grab them by the back of the neck and push their heads into the book, they're just going to throw it against the wall, or at least put it down on the table and not go back to it. And I want to give you an example. This book, and I don't know I don't think we can get a close-up of it. Are any of you fans of James Lee Burke? No? You should be. He's written a bazillion novels, and his daughter, Alifair, is now a very successful author in her own right. This particular one is called Burning Angel. I don't know exactly where, and it's backwards on my screen. So it's probably is on yours. I don't know where exactly it came into the series, but if you'll indulge me for just a minute, I want to read the first paragraph. The Giacono family had locked up the action in Orleans and Jefferson parishes back in Prohibition. Their sanction and charter came from the Chicago Commission, of course, and no other crime family ever tried to intrude upon their territory. Hence, all prostitution, fence operations, money laundering, gambling, shylocking, labor takeovers, drug trafficking, and even game poaching in South Louisiana became forever their special province. No street hustler, grifter, second-story creep, Murphy artist, dip stall, or low-rent pimp doubted that fact either, not unless he wanted to hear a cassette of what Tommy Figarelli had to say above the whine of an electric saw just before he was freeze-dried and hung in parts from the wood fan in his own butcher's shop. That's a little grim, but I dare anyone who likes thrillers or mysteries to read that paragraph and not say, okay, Susan, hold all my calls until I finish this book. Because it's just, I don't think that's something you can just put down. And it's important that you grab a reader, that you really grab a reader that way. In a shorter version, has anybody read All the Light We Cannot See? Yeah, did you like it? The very opening, this is not grim, it's not action-packed. This is the picture that the opening draws. At dusk, they pour from the sky. They blow across the ramparts, turn cartwheels over rooftops, flutter into the ravines between the houses. Entire streets swirl with them, flashing white against the cobbles. Urgent message to the inhabitants of this town, they say. Depart immediately to open country. That is pretty darn ominous. The book is about a young blind French girl and a young German boy caught up in World War II. And that's what it was like in Paris when the Germans were about to bomb the city. And again, this wasn't action packed, but it was so beautifully written. I read this book shortly after it came out. I think it was 1917 or 16. And I was doing a book tour in Florida. And when I finished the book, I closed it, and the first thought that went through my head was Pulitzer Prize. And sure enough, the next spring it won the Pulitzer. I'm getting some feedback of my own voice, and it's gone now. So, so if you have questions about how to start a book, I just gave you a couple of examples of what I like. The next step is something happens to the protagonist that begins to change his or her life. And as I said, he or she doesn't know how to deal with it, or if he can ever figure out how to deal with it. There are two ways to build the story from there. You can either do it in 4 acts, like a television show, or you can do it in 3 acts, like a stage play, like old stage plays. They don't write too many in 3 acts anymore. I prefer 4 acts, and I'll tell you why. My business partner is a veteran television writer, producer in Hollywood. And David always calls me when he's writing a script, and he says, Jean, I need help. I'm in Act 2. And that is the hardest act. Act 2 and 3 are the hardest act to write, but 2 is harder than 3. Because you have spent so much time thinking and planning how you're going to get into the story in Act 1 and how you're going to end it with this slapping the viewer in the face, that you haven't given enough thought to where you're going to go from there. And you can't just skip to the end. You've got to have things develop in between. So when you're sitting down to plan a story structure, be sure to pay attention to what you're going to do and what you're going to have your protagonist do in the middle act. Once you get to the end of Act 3, you can have something that explodes into the climax of the story, the climax being, by definition, the point at which the story starts to come to a conclusion. That's when you start down to the end. And they're fun. They're the most fun to write, I think. Let's talk about that before we talk. Well, then I'll give you a choice of things you want to go on to next. Sense of place, how to create good characters, and that sort of thing. But if you have any questions about story structure, let's get those out of the way now, because those are so important and they're so boring. So, does anybody have any questions about how you set a story up? You all know exactly how you're going to write your books. How many of you are writing books? How many of you are planning on writing books?
I just do like memoir, but I do have heard what you said. You get your character in trouble right away. You don't open it up talking about the weather. You get that character.
Not unless there's somebody stranded in the middle of the Atlantic in a hurricane. No, because that's you just got to you've got to grab the reader's attention. So the weather is not, unless you've got a beautiful scene that you want to wrap around the weather, it's still probably not a really good way to open a book. But even in a memoir, you know you can, or a biography or an autobiography, you can still, the story structure still works, because you wouldn't be writing the memoir if something really, really interesting hadn't happened, or a series of things hadn't happened to the main character, the main person in the book. And you need to pick out like one of the most interesting and start with that. And you can always go back and pick up the story, but you don't want to start the story at the beginning of the story. He was born in a hospital in Youngstown, Ohio in 1926. That's okay. So what? You can get into all that later. No matter what book you write, whether it is a novel or nonfiction, you're telling a story, and the story's got a main. Stories have structure, and there are a lot of different structures. You can even create your own structure if you want, if it works. But you won't know if it works until you try it. Anybody else? Okay, what do you want? Do you want next to go to character, sense of place? What were the other things we talked about? Dialogue.
You talked about dialogue. That's always a challenge. And in fact, if you have someone who has a Southern accent, I always heard you don't write the entire thing with that Southern accent. You say it in regular English, but you take like hints of that accent through the book.
Accents are very hard to read in a book. And what I tend to do is the only writer I've ever read, now I'm spacing his name, Friends of Eddie Coyle. It was a book that was written years and years and years ago, and the guy was from Boston, and he had the Boston criminal dialect down perfectly. And he wrote the whole book in it, and it was a pleasure to read. He's the only one I've ever known who could do it. What I would generally do, and my books are set in, the series at least, is set in Chicago. So and there's a very distinct dialect that's sort of peculiar to Chicago. And what I will do is have somebody who's I want to have the Chicago dialect say maybe use it for a chapter, and then I'll stop and I'll say, I'll just write it as though like I was writing an essay without dialect. But every once in a while I'll stick in a sentence that says, "Oh, for heaven's sakes," John said, except John pronounced heaven like haven, and put haven in quotes. And it reminds people that he's talking in a Chicago dialect. So it's not just Southern that you got to avoid. It's people don't like reading something in dialect. You've got to avoid using too much of any dialect, because it will just really screw with the reader's heads. You can use some, and every once in a while, you can run in a full sentence. But like John turned to me and he said in his typical Chicago dialect, blah 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 blah. And that'll work. That works just fine. Just don't try to write a whole book in any dialect. Some are harder than others, but that's in the writing. They're all difficult to read. I learned that the hard way. Any questions about dialect? Any questions about building characters?
I have a question on building characters. Do you have any strategies or advice for building a strong antagonist?
Of all the characters you'll write, that is probably the most fun one you'll write, because the antagonist has got a depth of personality and hang-ups and problems that are just wonderful fodder for creating a great psychological bad guy or bad woman. Antagonists are much easier to write than protagonists. One thing you should always remember is nobody is all bad and nobody is all good. So everybody, your antagonist should have some sort of redeeming quality. In one of my Deuce books, and I won't tell you which one, I don't want to spoil anything for you, the bad guy was really pretty bad, and he had a couple of chances to kill Deuce, who's the protagonist, and he always pulled off. And she asked him when he was lying on the ground dying at the end of the book, "Why didn't you kill me when you had a chance?" And he said, "I wasn't brought up that way." He was very Italian, mafia. He said, "I was taught to respect women. And while I don't like you, I respect you," or something like that. "And I couldn't kill you." And it's, that it may not sound in the telling like it's realistic, but it was actually a friend of mine in Chicago whose father was a hitman for the mob who told me that once over drinks. And he was a good friend, and he's a musician. He's not a bad guy. And I never forgot it. And one thing is, if you're a writer, nobody ever tells you anything that you forget. Your brain gets cluttered up with I could use that someday, And it came in very handy for me. So my biggest tip for you would be that when you're writing an antagonist, don't make him or her entirely awful. I've never been able to read the Hannibal Lecter books, even though I worked at the Associated Press with Thomas Harris. Oh, he was just Tom back then. I knew him pretty well, but I can't read that kind of book. I don't know if he had any redeeming social value whatsoever. He's the only one that comes to mind who might have skirted that. But it makes the character much more textured and layered for him to have his own stop button, if you will. That there are things even he won't do. Does that help?
It does. Thank you.
Okay, sure. Were there any others?
I was wondering, yes, how do you get to know your character? Do you free write, or do you answer a series of questions? How do you get to know your characters?
I try to get to know them very, very well before I even start to write them. I will literally lie in bed at night thinking about them and what they can do and what their backgrounds might be. I'm doing that right now with for the 5th Deuce book. And I try to become, it's a strange things to be doing in bed at night, I know, but I try to become very, very, very well acquainted with them. And still they surprise me. I will be going along in the book, and a character will take me someplace I never even anticipated going. I never even wanted to go. And I've learned that's truly when your right brain is taking over. And your right brain is at its most creative. And when that happens, just thank the little elf on your shoulder and ride with it. I have very frequently had situations where I realized what I was writing was never planned. I was going somewhere I never thought about going. And when I went back and read it the next day, it was some of the best stuff I wrote. So it's truly a eureka moment. So encourage it. I'm told eventually you can learn to put yourself in that state of mind. It's not something I ever learned to turn on and off. It happens or it doesn't. Usually, as near as I can tell, it's when I'm totally relaxed and don't have a lot of other things going on in my life that are intruding, and my brain can just run away with wherever it wants to go. That's when it usually happens for me. Hasn't happened much this year. Last February, I caught COVID before anybody even knew what it was. It was a light case, and I'm fine. And then the virus disrupted everybody's life, and I haven't written anything since last March. So it's fun getting back into it now. But I hope my right brain still remembers that it wants to help me.
I was going to say, did the COVID give you that foggy?
Well, I think Hope had follow-up.
Thank you. I was just going to ask, so are you a plotter or are you a seat of the pants writer? Sorry, Cindy.
It's okay.
I'm a plotter. The seat of the pants stuff comes when I'm in one of those places where the right brain has taken over. Then it's not me. It's just my brain is working on its own. But I believe in plotting, but I don't believe in over plotting. When I sat down to write my first novel, the outline that I wrote was as long as the book turned out to be. And it was so detailed that I found myself writing myself into corners because I was trying to follow the outline, and the outline wasn't taking me where the story needed to go. And I had to throw out huge pieces of the story. And eventually I just dismissed the outline. And by that time I was far enough into the book that I knew what I wanted to do anyway. So it wasn't a big problem. But don't over plan. You need to know where you're going, but you don't need to tie yourself to something so detailed that it doesn't give you any latitude for surprises. Does that make sense? Cindy, I'm sorry.
Well, you were talking about having COVID. Did you have that brain fog that people?
That's why I couldn't write. Even though I didn't have a very heavy case of it. It was over in about 6 days.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember much of it because I was sleeping 20 hours a day. I couldn't keep my head up. I had some serious fatigue problems even after the disease was gone, and I did have brain fog.
Well, when you do develop your characters. Your main character is a woman detective, right?
No,
What's
she's a journalist.
okay. What is the challenge of creating a male character? Because I'm sitting here thinking, I'm like, well, the short stories I've written have all been about women. How do you write a male character when you're a woman?
Carefully. Actually, Deuce was a man before he was a woman, and it had nothing to do with operations. When I wrote the first Deuce book, The Someday File, 4 times. I wrote it the first time I was living in Florida, and it was set in the then totally undeveloped marshy areas south of Tampa in Hillsborough County. And Deuce was a man. And I wasn't happy with the way it was going, and I just set it aside. Then I moved to Chicago, and I thought, after I got to know Chicago even better than I already did, I thought this would be a much better place. This area just outside Chicago would be a much better place to set the book than Florida. So I rewrote the whole thing. I did a lot of scouting for places, and I rewrote the whole thing and set it in Chicago. And Deuce was still a man. And I thought, this would be really a lot better if Deuce were a woman. And there is a lot more to turning a male character into a female character than changing he said to she said, because men don't react to situations the same way women do, or vice versa. And you have to have known a lot of men, I think, and kind of pick a man you would like the character to be or to be like, and maybe go with his mannerisms, his emotions, his way of expressing himself, and then just spin off from that, because you can't it's not as hard as it sounds. You just have to pay closer attention, because the way Deuce reacts as a woman is the way I react. So that's not hard. But when Deuce was reacting as a man, she was reacting the way my husband reacted when he was alive. And I loved him dearly, so I was, and I loved the way he did everything practically, and so it was nice to have him as a role model for the male Deuce. And I never told him that he was, and I'm glad in retrospect I didn't, because it might hurt his feelings when I changed her to a woman. What happened to me? But you just have to realize, accept the fact that men react to things differently than women, and incorporate those differences into your work. Anybody want to talk about sense of place? Is that an issue? Is that a problem? Is that a question as to why it matters? Because it really does matter.
I'd like to hear about that, because I'm not writing fiction, but I'm writing nonfiction stories about Selma.
It's interesting. It's more interesting if the place that you're trying to capture is an interesting place, like Chicago is. The way I go about it, which is most assuredly not the only way to do it, and it's just what works for me. You have to find what works for you, is to throw in, like if Deuce at one point is stopped she's on her way to meet somebody, and she stops at a traffic light, and she's on the south side of Chicago, near where the old stockyards were. and she starts to remember the stockyards and what they smelled like, and what they sounded like, and how they were eventually closed, and how the offal, OFFAL, from the stockyards were dumped into this one estuary, and how it's called Bubbly Creek because as all of those pig and cow innards, along with some human bodies that the mob threw in there, as they broke down, they put off methane, and I can't remember what the other gas is, and it bubbled to the surface, and so the water was always bubbling and became known as Bubbly Creek. It's a real place. And she's just thinking about this, and it actually becomes somewhat important later in the book. And she's just thinking about this while she's sitting at the traffic light. And then she's jarred out of her reverie by somebody honking behind her, and she realizes the lights changed. And that's the end of that. But it gave some color to that part of Chicago where she was going. And it introduced a place that would become important in the story later. But most of the people who have reviewed a lot of the people who have reviewed my books, either online or in publications, have said that it makes them feel like they're in Chicago with me. A couple of people have said that the restaurants that I use, which are all real, the restaurants I use, somebody said I went and I looked and they're all really where she says they are. And somebody else said that they were going to use it as a travel guide because they were going to Chicago on vacation and they wanted to go to all the restaurants that I used in the books. And that means they had some feeling for the city. And that was one of the greatest compliments they could have paid me, that I made them feel like they were in Chicago with Deuce. I was one retired police lieutenant from New York City who said, "I believe it or not, I've never been to Chicago, but your book has got it next on my list of places to go." So that's always nice to hear. But throwing in what the city smells like, what it looks like, or not necessarily the city, the country, whatever. Like with Bubbly Creek, Deuce remembers walking. The stockyards in Chicago have been closed since 71, I think. And she said she remembers walking in a neighborhood that's called the Back of the Yards on a story, and she caught this whiff of something, and it was a hot, humid day. The wind was just right. And she asked a lady on the street, "What is that I'm smelling?" And the lady said, "That's history." It was that awful smell of decaying flesh, which actually happened to me. So I thought that was a good line. What else do you want to talk about? We can talk about anything.
I have a question because I looked up a couple of things to prepare in case there were lulls in the conversation. This was 50 good questions to ask an author, and I starred this one. What was an early experience where you learned that language had power?
That is a good question. And it's one we all should be thinking about these days. I was a journalist. The first time it really slapped me in the face It was 1972, and I had just broken the Tuskegee study story, which you alluded to. For those of you, which may be all of you, too young to remember, that was a case government had found some federal doctors. They worked for what was then the U.S. Public Health Service. Had found a population of poor black farmers in Alabama who had syphilis. It was rampant in their community. And they decided it would be interesting to find out if untreated syphilis did a different kind of damage to black bodies than white bodies. And so they set up shop in Tuskegee, Alabama. They would not tell the men what disease they had. This was 1932 when this started. They would not give them treatment for the disease, and there were treatments. They wouldn't even give them treatments for the disease after penicillin was developed a few years later. One man found out what he had, and he made his way to a clinic in Montgomery to be treated. The doctors sent somebody after him to pull him back, and they told all the people in the study, and there were like more than 500 of them. They told the people in the study that there would be severe ramifications if any of them tried to escape again. I mean, it's cruelly ironic that this was going on in the United States while we were trying Germans on Nazi war criminals over in Europe. It was just awful. So I wrote the story. It broke. I'd been to Tuskegee. I went back to Tuskegee. And I was sitting on a park bench with a man named Charlie. And I was pretty jazzed about the story because it created hell from coast to coast. It was on the front page of every newspaper in the country, including the New York Times, which is hanging here on my wall. And I always said if I got a byline on the front page of the New York Times, which didn't give bylines to AP reporters, that I would retire. But seeing as how I was 23 at the time, I thought it might be a bit premature. Anyway, I was sitting on this park bench with Charlie, and I said, "Are you all right?" And he said, "You know, this usually makes me cry when I tell the story." He said, "You know, this used to be a friendly town. And now people cross the street to avoid shaking my hand." And that's when I thought to myself, what have I done to these people? And if that doesn't bring home the power of words, well, it certainly did. It certainly did to me. Of course, it got to be a friendly town again when the federal government settled out of court for something like $20 million, and there was all that money available for victims of the study and families of those who had died, which was a lot of money to spread around in a town that small and that poor in that era. But I've never, ever forgotten the look on his face when he said that to me, ever. I felt like I had changed his life forever, and not necessarily for the good. And you never want to be the reason that somebody's life is screwed up. But that was a good question, and I hope it was a decent answer. What's number 49 on your list?
How long on average does it take you to write a book? I mean, some of these are, you've been interviewed before. It's like, when are they going to ask an original question?
No, that's fine.
I like this one. What is the most unethical practice in the publishing industry? Hope you could answer this too.
agents.
And why do you say that?
As my wonderful friend Walter Satterthwaite often said, he was a wonderful mystery writer. He died earlier this year. Agents are scum. Now, I've had 3 agents in my life, 2 of whom were absolutely lovely people, one of whom worked her butt off for me, and one of them was scum. So that's not really fair. The publishing industry has changed so dramatically in the last 15 years that we haven't really identified the new era scum yet. Some of them are publishers who say they want to help indie writers, but they do anything but. Some of them are agents that charge. Don't ever sign with an agent who wants to charge you to read your manuscript. That is about as unethical as it gets. And yet they're all over the place. So I would say the most unethical thing I've ever run into are agents who charge to read manuscripts. I just don't. Nobody thinks that's ethical, including ethical agents.
Okay, here's another question. What are common traps for aspiring writers?
Thinking you're going to be the next Stephen King overnight. Thinking you're going to just sit down and write the book and then somebody's going to buy it. You may have to. My first book, I wound up rewriting, or at least tweaking, 8 or 9 or 10 times. It just took a long time to do it. Thinking it's easy is a terrible trap, because the writing is hard, the rewriting is harder. And I don't find writing a difficult thing to do. I thoroughly enjoy it. I've done it most of my life. Dialogue is probably easier for me than for some people, because I spent the first 30 years of my professional life just listening to people talk and writing down what they said to quote them in news stories. So I hear people talk in my head, and I don't think I'm insane, although that's probably still open to question. But dialogue comes easier for me because I know I've just picked up over the years the natural flows. For a lot of people, the dialogue is really, really difficult. And I would suggest that if we ever get to a point in this country where we can socialize with each other again, the best thing to do is be quiet and just listen as much as you can, because you will hear things that in the way people talk that you might not have picked up on before, all of which will help you write realistic dialogue. People don't talk in whole sentences. People talk over each other. People interrupt one another. All of which, except the talking over part, that's kind of, you can overdo that, but all the rest of it is fair game for dialogue. It makes it much more realistic.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the readers would recognize that.
I like this question, because sometimes when I beta read a manuscript of somebody else, it's like you're telling me too much. I want to do the work as a reader. So this question is, how do you balance making demands on the reader with taking care of the reader?
That's a question I've never heard before, and I'm not quite sure how to answer it. Can you be a little more specific about what you mean by making demands on the reader?
I just know when, well, like that book you talked about, how the light, the big thick book with the light in the title,
Yeah.
I could not get through that. I felt like it was demanding way too much of me, and it was like, I don't want to go there. It's like it's World War II, but also it was like a very involved story, and I was like, this author's asking too much of me. But then, like I said, I can beta read a new writer's manuscript, and I'll say, you're doing all the work. You're not leaving anything for the reader to do, because the reader wants to go on the adventure. The reader wants to put the clues together. How do
Now,
you
see, I didn't have that reaction to All the Light We Cannot See at all. I couldn't put it down. So I'm not sure there is one answer for all readers. I tend to have a fairly populous cast in my books. And I was making an appearance at a book fair once, and a lady in the audience stood up and said, there were too many characters for me, meaning I made her work too hard to remember them. And there are tricks that authors know. They're not tricks, actually, they're mechanisms where you can remind a reader partway through a book of who the various characters are and how important they are. And I'll give you an example in a minute. But for this particular reader, there were too many characters, but there were like like 4 or 5 different murder situations over a 60-year period, all of which came together in the end. And so when you're dealing with that much time, you're just naturally going to have a lot more characters, because basically that's almost, what, 2.5 generations that you're covering. And what the protagonist did was, she said, at one point she got frustrated with how complicated it all was, and she said, I need a wall mural. I need to take a whole wall of my condo and just start writing on it. And instead she took a yellow legal pad, and I just printed what she wrote on the pad, who each character was and why they were important to her investigation. And it didn't go on very long. It wasn't even a page, but it served as a reminder. I did it because it served as a reminder to readers who everybody was. And that's a totally legitimate thing to do if you've got a large cast. The funny thing was, after the woman stood up and she said there were just too many characters, the lady who had come to the book fair with her, was sitting next to her, said, I don't remember her name, but something like, Helen, if it's 3 characters, it's too many for you. So everybody's different. She's the only one I heard that from. But in that case, I did her. I couldn't have helped. I couldn't have changed it. There might have been a couple of characters I could have dropped, but she made me conscious of the fact that I can't just create characters forever. Oh, one thing I wanted to say about, speaking of characters, we went back to it, and Alexandra had asked me about writing a good protagonist. One thing you want to do is pay careful attention to even minor characters in your book, whether they're good or bad. Give them personalities, give them quirks, give them traits, give them tics, give them a favorite speech, or a favorite saying or something that they say when they're excited or mad or whatever. But give them, just because they're a minor character and they may not be important to the plot, if they're that minor, they probably shouldn't even be in the book. But just because they're a minor character doesn't mean they have to be boring. So be sure to pay as much attention, almost as much attention to your minor characters as your major characters. Your readers will thank you for that.
I have a question on editing. So I'm at the editing stage right now, and I'm on my third draft. What do you recommend to a new writer that is at this stage? Because that's what I am.
Where are you in terms of your satisfaction quotient?
I think once I get through this third draft, I will have finally be satisfied and ready for other people to read it, maybe possibly beta readers.
I'm generally, pick your beta readers carefully. I generally tell people to shy away from their friends, their relatives, and go to people who are professional beta readers, who are editors, because your friends and your relatives are going to say, "Oh, Alexandra, this is just wonderful. This is great. I love this. It's going to be so successful." And it's not that good yet. It needs work. And what they're telling you isn't going to help you. You need somebody who will tell you what's wrong with it, and maybe has the experience and the ability to tell you, to suggest ways you might fix it. Which brings me to yet another story. I've been living too long, too many stories. A young man named Ian Vasquez came to me about 2010, 2009, and Ian had written a book. Then he needed an editor. He needed somebody to read it, and I do that for a living. I was still a journalist, but I was partly doing that for a living too. And he wanted me to read his book because he said he kept sending it to agent after agent after agent, and nobody was interested. And he said it's like they didn't even read it, because they just, 2 days after I sent it, I'd get a letter saying, "Nope, doesn't fit in our plans." So I said, well, let me take a look at it. And I read the first chapter, and I knew immediately why he was getting turned down. 85% of the novels sold in this country are sold to women. And the protagonist in the book was a boxer, not a dog, a fighter. And it was all about him training and getting ready for his next fight. So I read the rest of the book, and I had some minor suggestions for the rest of the book too. But the big suggestion was, Ian, you've got to restructure the first chapter, because you're not going to find more than 2 women who are the least bit interested in boxing. Now, the wife of my business partner goes to a gym in a very bad section of Los Angeles to take kickboxing lessons 2 or 3 times a week. Not because she wants to be a boxer or a kickboxer, but because it's great exercise. And I showed her the chapter, and even she said she wouldn't be interested in reading the book. So he took my advice. He went back, he reworked the first chapter into something I thought was really good, and then tweaked the rest of the book. The first agent he sent it to picked it up, signed him, and the first A week later, she had a 3-book contract for him at St. Martin's Press. So you need somebody who will give you negative criticism, because positive criticism doesn't help. So that's what I would suggest, is that among your friends or writers that you know, or who will tell you the truth, and make sure they know that you want to hear the truth. You don't want false praise. What works for you, what doesn't work for you. That's who you want to be a beta reader.
That definitely helps. Thank you.
Sure. Floor is open. Oh, the other thing, I think this goes without saying, is don't leave your best action scenes, assuming, and when I say action scenes, it can be an argument, it can be something physical, whatever. Don't leave them, don't use them all up early in the book. You want the action to escalate through the story. You want the bad to get worse. The only exception that in any of the books I've written that have been published was one about a serial killer who was working in Tampa. And the opening chapter described him killing a woman, a doctor. And it was gruesome and it was horrible. And somebody said to me, Jean, how can you've said you can't read The Silence of the Lambs, but you could write this? And I said, yeah, because I'm in control. I know it's not real. And if it's too gruesome, I can tone it down. And if it needs to be more gruesome, I can jack it up. So I know it's not real. I don't know that when somebody else has written it. But I had a purpose for doing it that way. I found it so difficult to write something that grisly. That I knew when people read it, they would expect every murder that came after that to be even worse. And it would scare the bejesus out of them. And it would get worse. They would trick themselves. They would expect the worst in their heads. And so it didn't have to get worse. So I would build up to something that could be much worse, and then something would interrupt and it wouldn't happen. And I don't think there was ever another killing in the entire book, because because there didn't need to be. The people, my readers were doing the work for me. They were scaring themselves to death. And that was fine with me. But that was, when I say you can set up a story structure to meet your own expectations and your own needs and your own vision of what you want the story to be, that's the sort of thing I'm talking about. There was a purpose to what I did. It served the purpose, and I will never do it again. Do you understand what I mean?
I was going to ask, what was the hardest scene for you to write? And when you're describing the serial murders, I thought, well, maybe that was hard. But for me, it's the most mundane things, like trying to describe a Christmas parade. It's like, what do you pick out? Sometimes horses have glitter on their hooves, or the men carry a blanket down the street and people throw money into it so that kids can go Christmas shopping. I try to look for those details, but I can just almost get obsessed with trying to get it perfect and just driving myself nuts doing the mundane stuff. What do you find in your reading? What is the hardest thing for you to write?
It's not that. Um, I think in the Deuce Mora series, the hardest thing for me to write was killing off a character I loved. And I'm not giving anything away because he died. He dies right at the beginning of the book. In fact, my publisher was reading it and she called me and she said, "You killed Carl! You killed Carl!" And I said, "Yes, I did." She said, "Is there any way to get him back?" I said, "No, dead is dead." And but it really, I mean, she's a mystery writer herself, an Edgar Award-winning mystery writer, and I couldn't stop laughing because it was like, Julie, for God's sake, it's a story. It's not, but she loved this character, and but it was a situation where I was kind of finished with him. There was nowhere else to take him in the books. So to keep him, and I needed somebody to be hanging from a rope through a broken window in a glass tower in the Loop in Chicago. And it was, so he was the easiest one to dispense with because there was no place for him in the story. And I can't think now, I mean, I can't even imagine a place for him. But I'll tell you something funny. It was I had a, but that probably was actually, now that I think of it, the second hardest thing I've ever had to write. The first hardest was I wanted a part of this particular book to be a locked room mystery. Does everybody know what a locked room mystery is?
Mm-mm.
They were really popular, I want to say 80, 90 years ago. And a body would be discovered, a dead body in a locked room with no way it could have been locked by the killer. And I'm thinking of one in which there was a body lying on a bed in a hotel room, and the hotel room had been locked from the inside. It had a lever and you just opened it. From the outside, you had to lock it with a key. So there had to be a key, but it was sitting on the nightstand next to the dead body. So the killer couldn't have used it, because then how did he get it back on the nightstand? The other way to leave the room was through windows that had shutters on them. But the shutters were closed and locked from the inside. You couldn't open or lock them from the outside because it was on a high floor. So when you closed them from the inside, you had to lock them from the inside. So there was no way for the killer to have gotten out of the room. And it became a locked room mystery, and a rather famous one. And it turned out the solution to this book, as with almost every single locked room mystery ever written in those days, the solution was absolutely stupid. The killer had trained a monkey to stab the guy on the bed. And when the monkey left the room via the window, because he could jump to a tree, his body hit the shutters and they closed and locked behind him. Now, to me, that is the height of boredom. I mean, yawn. But it was kind of a challenge because I wanted to put a locked room mystery in this book. When I told told my publisher that, she said, "You can't do that." I said, "Why can't I?" And she said, "Because you can't pull it off." She said, "Nobody has ever been able to pull off a good locked room mystery." She said, "I've had a dozen authors in the house who've tried it and they had to give up on it because they couldn't make it work." She said, "I've tried it and I couldn't make it work." Well, that became a challenge. So I said, "I'll bet you $5 I can make it work." So I did. I wrote it and it worked. And she never said anything to me, but after I sent her the final draft of the book, I got an envelope from her with a $5 bill wrapped in a piece of plain white paper. She didn't say a word. It was just, I knew it was from her. And she was paying off the bet. So that was, that was a hard thing to pull off.
Well, it's 7:44. We've lost Hope. I would say maybe.
Oh, we did?
Yeah, she must have had to go somewhere. But if you have one more question, maybe, and then we can finish up. Anybody?
Go to your list.
Well, you answered one. Did you hide any secrets in your books that only a few people will find? Sounds like a locked room thing.
No, you're not. No. It gets explained. Oh, I wouldn't do that to a reader. That's not fair. That's like a mystery that ends with the butler the butler did it, and there's never been a butler in the room in the story. You can't do that to a reader. That's cheating. You can't have a killer be somebody who wasn't in the story, because especially in a mystery or a thriller, especially mysteries more than anything, or cozies or any genre of within the mystery family, you can't try to fool the reader, because half the fun of reading those books is being able to solve the mystery along with the protagonist. And solving the locked room mystery was an element of solving the much larger overarching storyline. So actually, I think Deuce solved the locked room mystery about a third of the way through the book. It didn't solve the overarching, but it served its purpose.
Well, one last question, and this is a good one because, like Hope has written several books, and some other writers I know, you tend to write a series. And in fact, publishers or agents want you to write a series. They want you to have the next book so you can sell the next book. So the question is, do you want each book to stand on its own, or are you trying to build a body of work with connections between each book?
Both. You want, because actually series are the only thing that are really, other than the stray standalone books that wind up on the bestseller list. Series are the best-selling things going. But in order to sustain sales, you need a lot of them. And my publisher isn't even taking on anybody who doesn't have 6 in the bank. Well, to write 6 books and not have tried to publish any of them is more. I think she's wrong. It's more than most people are willing to do. when she took me on, I had to have 3, which I had 2 and I was writing a third.
But do they stand alone, like
Yes, they
by
do.
book
You can
3 and
you can read them backwards, forwards, any way you want. They don't have any storylines that go from one to the next, except the love interest. I mean, that obviously extends over all of the books, but in terms of the crime, there are things that I refer back to, but they're not important that people remember them in order to read the books. So they will stand alone, and that's really important because there's no guarantee that even somebody who really likes book number 2 is ever going to buy 1 or 3 or 4 or 5. So you want them to enjoy whatever it is they're willing to indulge in.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jean. We appreciate you doing this. And again, Jean's website is jeanhellerbooks.com. And you can go there. And good luck, Ruthie and Alexandra, with your books, and Evelyn with your writing. And Dot and I are in a critique group. We meet at the new coffee shop in Selma once a month, like a third Thursday at 10 o'clock in the morning. And there's like 4 of us. And it'll go 2 hours. We each get probably a half an hour on whatever we've read. We give a segment like up to 10 pages. We give each other 2 weeks to read all the pieces. And then we're just brutally frank. We're not friends. We're not friends. We're there to talk. And it's so funny because the coffee shop owner, we meet in a back room, and she put up a sign that said ladies book club. And there's a guy in the group. So we're disguised as a book reading group. But we're really writers. You know,
That's the kind of group that Alexandra. That's the kind of group you want to look for.
Yeah. Other writers.
Not friends. Just people. Other people who write and will give you honest opinions.
That's right. Well, thank you, everyone.
And best of holidays to the extent that you can celebrate them, to all of you.
Stay home is what I've heard. Like,
actually, I'm going to my son's and daughter-in-law's house, but they have been as fanatical about masks and washing their hands and stuff as I have been. So I don't have any, and not inviting people over as I have been. So I have no qualms about that. But I think I've turned down 6 Thanksgiving invitations because one said no masks. And I said, how can you do that? And, well, it's going to be mostly outside if the weather's nice enough, and it'll be a buffet so people can stay separated. And I said, they won't be separated at the buffet table. They're going to be elbow to elbow.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be very long to pass. I don't know to this day where I caught it. So, but my doctor said, there's a distinct possibility that if you catch it a second time, it's a lot worse than the first. So I'm shut in until there's a vaccine waiting for me at my doctor's office.
Well, you can have a Zoom Thanksgiving. Everybody eat in your own place and talk on the
No, I'll be at Mark's house, but I think it'll just be the 3 of us.
All right. Well, y'all take care and keep writing.